The bullet had shattered more than bone. It had destroyed the only future Kyle Rourke ever wanted. Standing at Elena Vance's doorstep with a cane in one hand and shame carved into every line of his face, he'd come home to a woman who'd waited 5 years for a man who no longer existed. She looked at him like he was still whole. He knew better. And when the storm rolled in that night, it would force them both to face a truth more terrifying than any battlefield. That love doesn't ask for perfection. It demands you show up broken and fight anyway. If you want to see how a shattered soldier and a woman who refused to let go build something real from the wreckage, stay with me until the end. And hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The desert didn't forgive, and Red Mesa proved it daily. Cale Rourke had learned that truth the hard way, though by the time he arrived at the Vance farm with nothing but a bedroll and calloused hands, he'd already survived worse than sun and dust. The scars running up his left arm told one story. The deeper ones, the kind that didn't show, told another. Samuel Vance hired him without asking questions, which suited Cale fine. The old man needed help. His back wasn't what it used to be. His sons had left for easier prospects in the railroad towns, and the land itself seemed determined to swallow everything he'd built. Kyle could work. That was enough. "You don't talk much," Samuel observed one afternoon, watching Kyle repair a section of fence that had collapsed under the weight of a spooked horse. Cale drove another nail home. "Talking doesn't fix fences." Samuel grunted, something that might have been approval. "No, but it helps pass the time." "I'm fine with quiet." And he was. Quiet meant fewer chances to slip, to reveal anything about the years before Red Mesa. The war had ended 3 years ago, but men like Kyle, men who'd done what he'd done, didn't get parades or pensions. They got nightmares, and the hollow knowledge that the things they'd survived had cost them pieces they'd never get back. He kept to himself, slept in the small room off the barn Samuel offered him, rose before dawn, worked until his muscles screamed, fell into bed too exhausted to dream. It was a rhythm he could manage, a kind of penance that didn't require explanations. Then Elena came home. He was splitting wood behind the house when he first saw her, stepping down from a wagon with a worn travel bag slung over one shoulder. She wore a simple blue dress, dusty from the road, her dark hair pulled back in a braid that had started to come loose. Not beautiful in the delicate way men usually described women. Her features were too strong for that, her build too solid from years of farm work, but striking in a way that made Cale pause mid-swing. She caught him staring and smiled. Not flirtatious or coy, just warm, like she was genuinely glad to see another person, even a stranger covered in sweat and wood chips. "You must be the help Father wrote about," she called, crossing toward him with an easy stride. "Elena Vance." He set the axe down, suddenly aware of how rough he must look. "Cale Rourke. He treating you fair?" "More than." She studied him for a moment, and Kyle had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen for the first time in years. Not assessed like a potential threat or measured like hired labor, but actually looked at like a human being who might have thoughts and feelings beyond his capacity for work. "Good," she said finally. "He's stubborn as a mule about asking for help, so I'm glad he finally accepted he needed it." She glanced toward the house where Samuel had appeared on the porch. "I should go, but I'll see you at supper, I expect." It wasn't a question. Cale nodded anyway, watching her walk away with that same confident stride, calling out to her father before she'd even reached the steps. Supper turned out to be a livelier affair than Kyle was prepared for. Elena cooked, something involving salt pork, beans, and cornbread that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months, and filled the silence Kyle and Samuel usually left empty with stories from her time in Silverton, where she'd been helping her cousin with a new baby. 3 months old and already hollering like he's trying to wake the dead, she said, shaking her head with a grin. Sweet as honey when he's sleeping, though, just like his father. "That'd be Michael's boy?" Samuel asked. "Thomas. They named him after Michael's grandfather. Stubborn family," says the man who once spent 6 hours arguing with a horse about which direction to go. Samuel's mouth twitched. That horse was wrong. Elena laughed, a genuine sound that filled the small kitchen and made something in Kyle's chest tighten uncomfortably. He ate in silence, content to let the conversation wash over him, until Elena turned those sharp eyes his way. "What about you, Mr. Rourke?" You have family around here. No, ma'am. Just Elena is fine. Where are you from originally? He should have prepared for this. Should have had a story ready that sounded true without being complicated. Instead, he found himself caught between the truth and the wall he'd built to protect it. East, he said finally, moved around a lot. It wasn't technically a lie. He had moved around, just not by choice, and not in ways he could explain over cornbread and coffee. Elena's eyes lingered on him for another beat, and he had the unsettling feeling she knew exactly what he wasn't saying. But instead of pressing, she just nodded and passed him the cornbread. Well, we're glad to have you here now, aren't we, Father? Samuel grunted his agreement. Cale focused on his plate and tried to ignore the strange warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the food. The weeks that followed established a new pattern. Kyle still rose before dawn, still worked himself to exhaustion, but now Elena was part of the landscape, tending the vegetable garden, mending clothes on the porch, riding out to check the fence lines with a confidence that made it clear she'd grown up doing this work. She didn't push him to talk, but she didn't leave him alone either. She'd bring water when he was working in the sun, comment on the weather or the state of the crops, ask his opinion on whether the old plow could be salvaged or needed replacing. Small things, normal things, the kind of casual human interaction Kyle had forgotten existed. You're good with your hands, she observed one afternoon, watching him replace a hinge on the barn door that had rusted through. Needed to be. In your work before this? His jaw tightened. Something like that. She was quiet for a moment, and he thought maybe she'd finally take the hint and leave him be. Instead, she sat down on an overturned crate, apparently settling in. My mother used to say you could tell a lot about a man by watching him work, Elena said. Not just what he does, but how he does it. Whether he takes shortcuts or does it right. Whether he gets frustrated and gives up or pushes through. Kale tested the hinge, satisfied with the smooth swing of the door. What's your assessment then? That you're running from something, but you're not a quitter. The words hit harder than they should have. He turned to face her, found her watching him with that same unsettling directness. I'm not running, he said. I'm here. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt, and for a moment he thought she was going to push it, demand answers he couldn't give. Instead, she just smiled that warm, genuine smile that made his chest ache. Supper's in an hour, she said. Don't be late. Then she was gone, leaving Kyle alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable realization that Elena Vance saw too much. Summer burned into autumn. The work shifted, harvesting, preparing for winter, reinforcing structures against the cold that would come. Cale threw himself into it with the same relentless focus, grateful for the distraction. But Elena was always there, not hovering, not demanding, just present. She'd work alongside him sometimes, matching his pace with an easy competence that spoke to years of experience. Other times, she'd simply exist in the same space, reading on the porch while he repaired equipment nearby, humming while she hung laundry as he mended fence. It should have been uncomfortable. He'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of proximity, this potential for connection. Instead, it felt like breathing after being underwater too long. You ever think about settling down? She asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of orange and red. Samuel had gone to bed early, leaving them alone with the crickets and the distant howl of coyotes. Settling down? Having a place of your own, family maybe. Cale's hand tightened on the coffee cup. Not much point in planning for things that aren't going to happen. Why not? Because men like him didn't get second chances. Because the things he'd done, the blood on his hands, made him unfit for the kind of life she was describing. Because even thinking about it felt like tempting fate to take what little he had left. Just doesn't seem likely, he said instead. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I think people tell themselves that when they're scared, that it's easier to say something's impossible than to admit they want it and might not get it. You speaking from experience? She smiled, but it was smaller this time, sadder. Maybe. I watched a lot of men come back from the war different than they left. Some of them couldn't settle, kept moving, kept running, like they thought if they stopped, everything they'd left behind would catch up. She turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes were impossibly gentle. But staying still isn't the same as giving up. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. Kale wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that she didn't understand, couldn't understand what it meant to carry the weight he did. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat there with Elena Vance on a porch in the middle of nowhere, watching the desert swallow the sun, and felt something inside him begin to crack. Winter came hard and fast. Snow buried the desert in a way that seemed impossible given the brutal heat of summer, transforming Red Mesa into a landscape of white silence. The work changed again, feeding animals, breaking ice, keeping the house warm, surviving. Kyle had thought the cold would bring distance, that being trapped indoors would make things awkward. Instead, it drew them closer. Long evenings by the fire, Samuel telling stories from his youth while Elena mended and Kale whittled pieces of wood into simple tools or toys. Quiet mornings working together to clear paths through the snow. Shared meals that became less about sustenance and more about the excuse to sit together. He caught himself watching her sometimes. The way she'd tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear while she was concentrating. The small furrow between her brows when she was working through a problem. The easy laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine. It terrified him. "You're doing it again," she said one afternoon. They were alone in the barn, working to repair a section of roof before the next snowfall hit. "Doing what?" "Staring like you're trying to memorize me." She didn't look up from the board she was measuring. "In case you have to leave." The accuracy of it stole his breath. "Elena, I'm not asking you to explain." She set down the measuring tape and finally met his eyes. "But I need you to know something. Whatever you're running from, whatever you think makes you unsuitable for a normal life, it doesn't scare me. I see you, Kyle. Not the version you think you need to be. You. You don't know what you're seeing, don't I?" She moved closer, and Kyle's heart hammered against his ribs. "I see a man who works himself to exhaustion because he doesn't think he deserves rest, who flinches every time someone shows him kindness like it's a trick, who looks at my father with respect and at me like I'm something fragile he's afraid to break." Her hand came up, fingers brushing the edge of the scar on his forearm. "I see someone who's survived things I can't imagine and still gets up every morning and chooses to keep going. That's not weakness, Kyle. That's strength." He should pull away. Should put distance between them before this went somewhere he couldn't follow. But Elena was looking at him like he was worth something, like the broken pieces he'd spent years trying to hide were somehow acceptable, and he couldn't bring himself to move. "I don't have anything to offer," he said, voice rough. I'm not asking you for anything except honesty." "Are you going to run?" The question hung between them, sharp and unavoidable. Kale thought about the road that had brought him here, all the places he'd passed through without stopping, convinced that staying meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. He thought about the nightmares that still woke him in the dark, the memories he couldn't outrun no matter how far he traveled. Then he looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw something he'd stopped believing in years ago. Not pity or charity or blind optimism, but genuine acceptance. She knew he was damaged. She'd figured that out weeks ago, and she was still here, still looking at him like he was worth the risk. "No," he said finally. "I'm not going to run." Her smile could have lit the whole barn. "Good. Now hand me that hammer before this roof caves in on both of us." They worked in companionable silence after that, but something had shifted. The wall Kyle had built so carefully was crumbling, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't sure he wanted to rebuild it. Spring arrived with the same dramatic flair as winter had left. Sudden warmth melting the snow into rushing streams, new grass pushing through the mud, the whole world shaking off death and choosing life again. The farm demanded attention, planting, repairing winter damage, preparing for the cycle to start over. Kyle found himself working alongside Elena more often, their partnership as natural as breathing. She'd hand him tools before he asked. He'd anticipate where she'd need help without her having to say. They developed a rhythm that spoke to something deeper than efficiency, a connection built on trust and shared purpose. Samuel noticed, of course. The old man wasn't blind. "You planning on sticking around?" he asked Kyle one morning while Elena was in town. They were working on the irrigation system, trying to coax water where it needed to go. "If you'll have me." Samuel was quiet for a moment, testing a connection. My daughter's a smart woman, strong, knows her own mind. Yes, sir. She's also been alone too long. Turned down every man in 3 counties because none of them saw her right. Saw a farmhand or a wife or a means to an end, but not her. He straightened, fixing Cale with a look that was equal parts assessment and warning. You see her right? Cale thought about Elena's laugh, the way she'd sit with him in silence when he couldn't find words, how she'd never once asked him to be anything other than what he was. I'm trying to. That'll do. Samuel returned his attention to the irrigation ditch. Just don't make me regret trusting you. I'll do my best not to, sir. The conversation settled something in Kyle he hadn't realized was unsettled. Samuel's approval mattered, not because Kyle needed permission, but because it meant he wasn't fooling himself. Elena's father, who'd known her all her life, thought Kyle was worth the risk. That had to count for something. The weeks rolled into months, spring becoming summer again, and Kyle allowed himself something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. Small hope, careful hope, but hope nonetheless. He and Elena didn't rush anything. There were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures. Instead, they built something steady and real through quiet moments and shared work. A hand on her back as he passed, her fingers brushing his when she handed him coffee. Sitting closer on the porch in the evenings until their shoulders touched. Small intimacies that felt monumental to someone who'd convinced himself he'd never deserved them. What are you thinking about? Elena asked one evening. They were watching the sunset again, a ritual that had become theirs. That I don't recognize myself anymore. In a bad way? He considered it. A year ago, even 6 months ago, the answer would have been yes. Now? No. In a strange way, maybe, but not bad. She leaned against him, her head finding his shoulder with an ease that still made his heart stutter. Good, strange? Yeah, he said softly, wrapping an arm around her. Good, strange. They stayed like that until full dark, 2 people who'd both survived more than they'd ever wanted to, choosing to build something new from the pieces they had left. It wasn't perfect. Kyle still woke some nights in a cold sweat, had moments where the past grabbed him by the throat and wouldn't let go. Elena had her own scars, losses and disappointments she rarely talked about, but that shaped her as surely as his shaped him. But they were here, together. And for Cale Rourke, who'd spent so long convinced he deserved nothing but dust and distance, that was more than he'd ever dared to hope for. The future remained uncertain. War had taught him that nothing was guaranteed, that the world could shatter in an instant and leave you standing in the wreckage wondering how to move forward. But as he sat on that porch with Elena warm against his side and Red Mesa stretching out before them in the gathering dark, Kyle made himself a promise. Whatever came, he wouldn't run. Not from this. Not from her. He'd finally found something worth staying for. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, carried by a rider whose dust cloud Cale spotted from the field long before the horse reached the gate. Something about the urgency in the man's posture made his stomach clench even before he saw the official seal on the envelope. Samuel took it with steady hands, but his face went pale as he read. Elena appeared in the doorway, apron still tied around her waist, and the way her father looked at her told Kyle everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. They're calling up the reserves, Samuel said quietly. Conflicts escalated near the northern territories. They need experienced fighters. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Kyle had known this peace was borrowed time. Men like him didn't get to walk away clean, didn't get to pretend the past stayed buried just because they wanted it to. But he'd let himself believe it anyway, let himself think that maybe, just this once, he could have something good without it being ripped away. When? Elena's voice was controlled, but Kyle could hear the tremor underneath. 2 weeks. They're mobilizing quickly. Cale forced himself to speak. I'll need to report to Fort Jackson for assignment. Samuel nodded slowly, folding the letter with care that seemed more about keeping his hands busy than preserving the paper. Suppose there's no arguing with it. No, sir. Elena's eyes found Kyle's across the distance, and the pain there nearly broke him. But she didn't cry, didn't protest. She just straightened her shoulders and nodded once, then turned back into the house without a word. The 2 weeks that followed existed in a strange suspension of time. Simultaneously, Too long and nowhere near enough. Kael kept working because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant acknowledging what was coming. Elena moved through her days with a brittle determination, speaking less, smiling rarely, but never once asking him not to go. They both knew there was no choice. "You could run," she said one night. They were in the barn, ostensibly checking on a mare that was close to foaling, but really just stealing moments away from Samuel's knowing eyes. "Head west. They'd never find you out there." "They would. And even if they didn't, I'd know." Kael leaned against a support beam, exhaustion pulling at him. "I ran once, from the last war. Told myself I was done, that I'd given enough. Then I saw what happened to the places that didn't have enough people willing to fight, and I realized running just meant someone else had to stand in my place." "So you're doing this for strangers?" "I'm doing this because if I run now, I'll spend the rest of my life being the kind of man who lets other people pay his debts." He reached for her hand, relieved when she let him take it. "And I can't be that man. Not for you. Not for myself." Elena's fingers tightened around his. "I hate that you're right. I know. And I hate that I can't ask you to stay." "I know that too." She stepped closer, and Kael pulled her against him, memorizing the way she fit in his arms, the scent of soap and sun in her hair, the steady rhythm of her breathing. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding on to each other like they could somehow stop time through sheer force of will. "Promise me something," Elena said finally, her voice muffled against his chest. "Anything. Come back. I don't care how long it takes or what shape you're in when you do. Just come back." The promise stuck in his throat because they both knew it wasn't one he could guarantee. Men went to war and didn't return all the time. He'd seen it happen, had been the one to survive when better men didn't. Making a promise he might not be able to keep felt like the worst kind of lie. But Elena was looking up at him with those steady eyes that had seen through every wall he'd built, and he couldn't bring himself to offer her anything less than hope. "I'll do everything I can to make it back to you," he said. "That's the truth. I can't promise fate won't have other ideas, but I can promise I'll fight like hell to get home." She nodded, accepting it for what it was, not a guarantee but the best he could offer. Then she kissed him, fierce and desperate, and full of all the things neither of them knew how to say, and Kael kissed her back like a drowning man gulping air. The day he left dawned clear and merciless. Kael packed his few belongings, checked and rechecked the supplies he'd need for the journey to Fort Jackson, and tried not to notice how Samuel kept finding excuses to be nearby, like proximity could somehow change what was coming. "You take care of yourself out there," the old man said gruffly, shaking Kael's hand with a grip that was still surprisingly strong. "And you come back when it's done. You've got a place here. Remember that." "I will, sir. Thank you." "No thanks needed. You earned it." Samuel's jaw worked for a moment. "I'll watch after her while you're gone. She's strong, but—" "I know." Kael swallowed hard. "I'm counting on you." Elena appeared then, and Samuel tactfully retreated, leaving them alone in the yard with the packed horse and the weight of goodbye. She'd braided her hair that morning, Kael noticed, worn the blue dress she'd had on the first day he saw her. Like maybe she was also trying to memorize things, to create anchors for the time ahead. "I made you something," she said, pulling a small object from her pocket. It was a simple carving, a small piece of wood no bigger than his thumb, shaped and smoothed into the rough outline of a bird in flight. "It's not much, but I thought, I don't know. Maybe it could remind you that there's somewhere worth flying back to." Kael's vision blurred as he took it, turning the carving over in his hands. The workmanship was careful but unpracticed. She'd clearly spent hours on it despite having no real skill with whittling. That made it more valuable than anything he'd ever owned. "It's perfect," he said roughly. "I'll keep it with me. Always." "Good." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through it. "And Kael? I meant what I said. Come back. Even if it takes years, even if you think I've moved on or forgotten or found someone else, I won't have, so just come back." He wanted to argue, to tell her she shouldn't wait, shouldn't put her life on hold for something as uncertain as his return. But the words wouldn't come because he was selfish enough to want exactly that. To want her waiting, to want this to be here when the war finally let him go. So instead, he kissed her one last time, trying to pour every unspoken feeling into it, then climbed onto his horse before he could change his mind. He made himself look back once, at the top of the ridge. Elena was still standing in the yard, one hand raised, and even from a distance, Kael could see she wasn't crying. She was being strong for him, giving him something to hold on to besides grief. Then he turned his horse north and rode away from the only home he'd ever really had. Fort Jackson was organized chaos, hundreds of men arriving daily, most of them reserves like Kael, who thought their fighting days were behind them. The reality of what they were walking into settled over the camp like a blanket of grim acceptance. This wasn't a glorious cause or a clear mission. This was a border dispute that had escalated into something uglier, fueled by politics and territory, and the kind of pride that got men killed. Kael reported to the commanding officer, a colonel named Brennan, who looked like he'd aged a decade in the past month. "Rourke," Brennan said, scanning the service record Kael had submitted. His eyebrows rose. "You were at Copper Ridge?" "Yes, sir." "And Silver Creek, and the massacre at Dead Horse Canyon?" Brennan set the papers down, studying Kael with new interest. "You're one of Morrison's scouts." The name hit like a fist. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison had been Kael's commanding officer during the worst years of the last war. A brilliant tactician with a talent for getting his men into impossible situations and somehow getting them out alive. Kael had respected him, had also watched him slowly lose pieces of his humanity with every decision that traded lives for objectives. "I was, sir. Morrison's leading the Northern Advance. He specifically requested experienced scouts. I'm assigning you to his unit." Dread coiled in Kael's stomach. Working with Morrison again meant going back to the kind of warfare he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, hit-and-run tactics, the kind of fighting where you learn to sleep light and trust no one. "Understood, sir. Report to Captain Webb. He'll get you integrated with your squad." "And Rourke?" Brennan's expression softened slightly. "I know you didn't choose to be here. None of us did. But we need men who know what they're doing. Try to stay alive long enough to use that experience." "I'll do my best, sir." The squad Kael was assigned to was a mix of veterans and younger soldiers who'd never seen real combat. Captain Webb was competent but green. He'd missed the last war by a year and was clearly struggling with the gap between his training and the reality they faced. "Rourke's got more field experience than any 3 of us combined," Webb told the squad during their first briefing. "You listen to what he says. It might keep you breathing." The men eyed Kael with varying degrees of respect and resentment. He didn't particularly care which. His job was to scout, report, and survive long enough to get home. Making friends wasn't part of the equation. They moved north within the week, joining Morrison's larger force as it pressed toward the disputed territory. The landscape shifted from desert to scrubland to rocky hills that provided too many places for ambushes and not enough cover when you needed it. Morrison hadn't changed much. Still tall and rail-thin, still wearing that expression of permanent calculation, like he was always 3 moves ahead of everyone else. "Rourke," he said when Kael reported to his tent, "I was hoping you'd survived. How's civilian life treating you?" "Treated me fine until I got pulled back." Morrison's mouth twitched. "Fair enough. I won't waste time on pleasantries then. The situation's worse than the official reports indicate. We're not just dealing with organized resistance. There are multiple factions operating independently, which means no predictable patterns, no central command to disrupt. It's going to be ugly. It usually is. I need you doing what you do best, getting ahead of the main force, identifying threats, finding routes that won't get us all killed. You'll have a 2-man team, pick from Webb's squad." Kael thought about it. The kid with the dark hair, Thomas something, and the older one, Garrett. Why those 2? Thomas is scared but smart. He'll follow orders and think on his feet. Garrett's been through something. I can see it in the way he moves. Rather have someone who knows how to handle fear than someone who hasn't met it yet. Morrison nodded slowly. "Good instincts. They're yours. Try to bring them back in one piece." The first mission was supposed to be simple reconnaissance. Scout a pass that intelligence suggested might be a supply route, confirm enemy presence or absence, report back. Simple. Except nothing was ever actually simple once you were in the field. They moved out before dawn, 3 men crossing terrain that got rougher with every mile. Thomas? His full name was Thomas Brenner, no relation to the colonel, kept up without complaint despite clearly being terrified. Garrett was solid, watching their flanks without needing to be told. They were 2 miles from the pass when Kael caught the first sign of trouble. Disturbed earth that was too regular to be natural, the kind of displacement that came from recent foot traffic trying to cover its tracks. "Hold," he said quietly, raising a fist. Both men froze. Kyle studied the ground, following the barely visible trail with his eyes. It led up the hillside to their right, disappearing into a cluster of rocks that would provide perfect cover for anyone watching the trail below. "We're being observed," he said. "Maybe half a dozen positions above us. They're good. Most people would have missed it." "Do we engage?" Thomas asked, his voice tight. "No, we're outnumbered, and they have position. We mark it, pull back, report." It was the smart call, the safe call. But Kael's instincts were screaming that something was wrong, that the positioning was too deliberate, too much like the explosion knocked him sideways before his brain could complete the thought. 1 second he was standing, the next he was on the ground with his ears ringing and dust choking his lungs. Training kicked in before conscious thought: roll, find cover, assess threats. Thomas was down, bleeding from his leg but conscious. Garrett had been thrown clear and was already returning fire at shapes moving through the smoke. Kyle grabbed Thomas and dragged him behind a boulder just as bullets started chewing up the ground where they'd been standing. "Can you shoot?" Kyle demanded. Thomas nodded, face white with pain but hands steady as he checked his rifle. "Then cover that approach. Garrett, with me." They held position for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 10 minutes. Long enough for Kyle to understand that this wasn't a random ambush. This was coordinated, planned, the kind of trap that required intelligence about patrol routes and timing. Someone had known they were coming. When the firing finally stopped, 3 enemies lay dead, and the rest had melted back into the rocks. Kyle's squad had survived, but Thomas needed medical attention, and they were now miles from camp with hostile forces between them and safety. "Can you walk?" Kyle asked Thomas. "I can try." "Good enough. Garrett, take point. I'll help Thomas." We move fast, and we move quiet. They made it back to camp after dark, exhausted and bloody, but alive. Morrison listened to Kyle's report with a grim expression. "They knew you were coming," he said, "which means either they've got scouts better than ours, or someone's feeding them information. Or both. Or both." Morrison rubbed his face. "All right, get some rest. I'll need you back out there in 48 hours. The pattern repeated. Scout, report, survive. Repeat. Weeks bled into months. Kyle stopped counting days and started measuring time by missions completed, by the narrowing margins between close calls and actual disasters. He kept the wooden bird Elena had given him in his breast pocket, checking for it compulsively like a talisman. Letters from home were irregular, dependent on supply lines and the whims of whatever mail service was currently functioning. When they did arrive, Kyle read them over and over until the paper wore soft at the creases. Elena wrote about the farm, about Samuel's ongoing battle with the irrigation system, about small moments of daily life that felt impossibly distant from where Kyle was. She never complained, never asked him for reassurance he couldn't give. She just wrote like she was talking to him across the table, keeping him tethered to the world he'd left behind. "I think about you every day," one letter said. "I wonder if you're safe, if you're warm, if you're eating enough. I know you probably can't answer most of my questions, and that's all right. Just know that whatever you're going through, you're not going through it alone. I'm here, holding space for you, keeping home ready for when you return. Because you will return, KL. I believe that with everything I am." He wrote back when he could, though his letters were shorter, more cautious. The sensors would black out anything operational, and beyond that, he couldn't find words for what he was experiencing. How could he describe the weight of watching men die? The calculations he made daily about whose life had the best chance of mattering, the slow erosion of the pieces of himself he'd worked so hard to rebuild. Instead, he wrote about small things. A sunset that reminded him of Red Mesa, a bird he'd seen that looked like her carving, the way he could still remember exactly how she'd looked standing in the yard the day he left. Winter came to the Northern Territories with a viciousness that made Red Mesa's cold seem gentle by comparison. Supply lines struggled. Morale dropped. Men started making mistakes born of exhaustion and cold, and the grinding knowledge that this war had no clear end in sight. Kyle was on a routine patrol when everything went wrong. They'd been tracking what intelligence suggested was a small enemy supply cache, 4 men moving through terrain that got progressively more hostile. The snow was falling hard enough to limit visibility to maybe 20 yards, which meant they didn't see the ambush until it was too late. The first volley caught them in the open. Martinez went down immediately, killed before he could even register the threat. Kyle and the other 2 scattered, finding what cover they could while return fire tore through the falling snow. "Fall back!" Kyle shouted, but Collins was already hit, clutching his side and trying to crawl toward cover. Kyle made a choice. The smart play was retreat, save who could be saved, leave the dead and dying. But Collins was 19 years old and scared, and Kyle couldn't make himself do it. He broke cover, running low toward Collins's position, got his arm under the kid and started dragging him back. Almost made it. The impact felt like being kicked by a mule, a burning punch of force that spun Kyle sideways and sent him crashing down. His leg collapsed underneath him, pain exploding through his knee and hip with enough intensity to white out his vision for a few crucial seconds. When his sight cleared, he was on the ground with Collins beside him and enemy soldiers advancing through the snow. Garrett appeared from somewhere, laying down covering fire, screaming at Kyle to move. Kyle tried. The leg wouldn't hold, wouldn't even bend right. "Go!" he shouted at Garrett. "Get Collins, and go! Not leaving you! That's an order! Get him out of here!" For a horrible moment, Kyle thought Garrett would refuse. Then the older man cursed viciously, grabbed Collins, and disappeared into the storm. Kyle raised his rifle with hands that barely worked, determined to at least take some of them with him. He got off 3 shots before reinforcements arrived, Morrison's main unit drawn by the sound of sustained gunfire. The enemy melted back into the snow, unwilling to engage a larger force. Kyle sagged back against the frozen ground, the wooden bird still somehow pressed against his chest, and waited for the medics. The field surgeon was blunt. "The bullet shattered your kneecap and did significant damage to the surrounding tissue. I can patch you up, but you're not going to be the same. Even in the best-case scenario, you're looking at a permanent limp and chronic pain. Worst case, you lose the leg entirely. What are my chances of returning to duty? Combat duty? 0. I'm recommending you for medical discharge." The word should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like another amputation, proof that the war had taken everything he'd rebuilt and left him with less than he'd started with. They evacuated him south within the week, back to a larger medical facility where surgeons with better equipment and more time could assess the damage. The verdict remained the same. The leg was permanently compromised. He'd walk again, probably, but not well. Not like before. Kale spent 3 months in recovery, learning to navigate with a cane, rebuilding wasted muscle, and coming to terms with the reality that the man who'd left Red Mesa was gone. This version, broken, slower, diminished, was all that was left. "You're being difficult," the doctor said one afternoon, finding Kyle refusing pain medication again. "There's no shame in accepting help. I need to know what I'm working with," Kyle said through gritted teeth. "Need to understand my limits without the drugs hiding them." "Your limit is that you're disabled. That's not going to change whether you take the medication or not." The word hung in the air between them. Disabled, damaged, less than. All the things Kale had spent years fearing he'd become, now confirmed by medical assessment and official paperwork. The formal discharge came through in early spring. Kale signed the papers, accepted his final pay and the pension for disabled veterans, and tried to figure out what came next. Going back to Red Mesa was the obvious answer. Elena was there. Samuel was there. The life he'd started building was there. But the thought of showing up like this, broken, dependent, a shadow of the man who'd left, made his stomach turn. What could he possibly offer Elena now? He could barely walk without assistance. Couldn't work the way he used to. Could barely take care of himself, let alone contribute to a working farm. She deserved better. Deserved someone whole. The rational part of his brain knew he was spiraling, knew these thoughts were born of pain and exhaustion and the same self-destructive patterns he'd fought against before. But the injured animal part, the piece that had learned survival meant not being vulnerable, was louder. So instead of heading south toward home, Kyle found himself in a veterans boarding house in a town called Redemption, 3 days' ride west of Red Mesa. It was a temporary solution, he told himself, just until he figured out how to be this new version of himself. until he could face Elena without feeling like he was asking her to settle for scraps. He got a job doing light work at the local feed store, inventory, bookkeeping, things that didn't require being on his feet all day. The owner was a veteran himself and asked no questions about Kayel's limp or the way he sometimes had to sit down suddenly when the pain got too bad. The letters from Elena continued. At first confused, why was he in redemption instead of coming home? Then worried. Then, as weeks turned to months without adequate explanation, hurt. "I don't understand," she wrote. "You survived. You made it home. That's all I asked for. Why won't you come back? Did something change? Did I do something wrong? Please, Kayel, just tell me what's happening." He should have written back honestly. Should have explained the shame and fear and the crushing weight of feeling like he'd become exactly the burden he'd always been terrified of being. Instead, he sent short, vague responses that said nothing and hurt her more than silence would have. "I'm figuring some things out. Don't wait for me." It was the coward's way. Kayel knew it even as he sealed the envelope. But he couldn't make himself do better, couldn't make himself offer her the truth when the truth felt like asking her to carry weight she shouldn't have to bear. 5 years passed that way. Kayel built a quiet, limited existence in redemption, working at the feed store, living in the boarding house, maintaining a careful distance from anything that might require more than he could give. He told himself he was being selfless, protecting Elena from the reality of what he'd become. The truth was simpler and uglier. He was afraid. Afraid that seeing him like this would kill whatever feelings she'd had. Afraid that he'd become the kind of burden he'd spent his whole life trying to avoid being. Afraid that the home he'd found at Red Mesa had only ever been real because he'd been useful, and now that he wasn't, there would be nothing left. So he stayed in redemption, and the letters from Elena eventually stopped coming, and Kayel told himself it was better this way. He almost believed it. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when Garrett walked into the feed store. Kayel was inventorying sacks of grain in the back room, his knee aching from the morning's rain, when he heard the bell above the door chime. He didn't look up immediately. Customers were common enough, and his boss Marcus handled most of the front-end work, while Kyle stayed in the back where his limp wasn't on display. "Looking for someone," a familiar voice said. "Man named Kyle Rourke. Heard he might work here." Kayle's hand stilled on the ledger. He knew that voice, had heard it calling warnings through gunfire, cursing at impossible situations, staying steady when everything else fell apart. "Kayel?" Marcus called back. "Yeah, he's here. In the storage room." There was no avoiding it. Kayel set down his pen and made his way to the front, leaning harder on his cane than usual because the weather had his leg in knots. Garrett stood by the counter, older and more weathered than Kayel remembered, but unmistakably the same man who'd wanted to stay behind in that snowstorm 5 years ago. Recognition flashed across Garrett's face, followed quickly by something that looked like anger. "So it's true," Garrett said flatly. "You are alive. Last I checked." "That's all you've got to say? 5 years of nothing and that's it?" Marcus looked between them, clearly sensing this wasn't a friendly reunion. "I'll just give you two some privacy." He disappeared into the office, leaving them alone among the feed sacks and farm equipment. "What are you doing here?" Kayel asked, trying to keep his voice level. "Looking for you." "What does it look like?" Garrett crossed his arms. "You know how long I spent thinking you died somewhere between the medical facility and home? How many times I tried to find out what happened to you after discharge?" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Like hell you didn't mean to. You disappeared on purpose." Garrett's jaw worked. "I get that the injury was bad. I was there, remember? Saw what that bullet did to your leg. But that doesn't explain why you've been hiding in this backwater town instead of going home to the woman who's been looking for you for half a decade." The words hit like physical blows. "Elena's looking for me?" Elena, Samuel, half the county. She came to the veterans office in Silverton 2 years ago, asking if anyone had records of where you ended up. Showed them letters you'd sent from Redemption, wanted to know if anyone could help her find the exact location. Garrett shook his head in disgust. "I ran into her by accident 3 months ago. She's still on that farm, still alone, still waiting for a man who apparently decided she wasn't worth coming back to." "That's not..." Kayle's throat closed up. "It's not like that." "Then what's it like? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you got hurt and decided that was a good enough excuse to give up." The accusation stung precisely because it was accurate. Kayel had given up, not on living exactly, but on the idea that he deserved the life he'd started building. He'd convinced himself it was noble, that he was protecting Elena from the burden of his broken body. Now, hearing it spoken aloud, it just sounded pathetic. "My leg is destroyed," Kyle said quietly. "I can barely walk. Can't work the way I used to. Can't do half the things I could before." What was I supposed to offer her? A cripple who needs help with basic tasks? Garrett's expression shifted from anger to something colder. "You know what Collins told me before he shipped back east? He said you saved his life. Said you took that bullet because you went back for him when the smart play was to leave him. He stepped closer. You made that choice, to value his life over your ability to walk. And now you're telling me that sacrifice means nothing because it left you damaged? That's garbage, Rourke. That's you being so wrapped up in your own fear that you can't see past it." "You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You're scared. War, you could handle. Getting shot, you survived. But facing the woman you love and letting her see you're not the same, that terrifies you." Garrett's voice softened slightly. "I get it. I do. But you're not protecting her by staying away. You're just making her think she wasn't worth fighting for." The truth of it settled over Kyle like a weight. All these years, he'd told himself he was being selfless, that staying away was the kind thing to do. But Garrett was right. It was fear. Fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear of being seen as less than he'd been. And in service of that fear, he'd hurt the one person who'd asked nothing from him except that he come home. "She stopped writing 2 years ago," Kyle said. "I figured she'd moved on. She stopped writing because you kept telling her not to wait. What was she supposed to do? Keep pouring her heart out to someone who wouldn't even give her a straight answer about why he was staying away?" Garrett pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I wasn't sure I'd find you. Wasn't even sure I should tell you if I did. But then I thought about what you said to me that day in the snow, that Collins deserves someone fighting for him. Well, so does Elena. And if you're not going to do it, at least have the guts to tell her to her face instead of hiding behind letters and distance." He thrust the paper at Kyle. It was a map with a route marked in pencil. Redemption to Red Mesa, 3 days' ride with notations about where to find water and shelter. "Storm's coming in tonight," Garrett said. "Big one, according to the locals. But it should clear by morning. If you leave at first light, you can make it there before the next system rolls through." He turned toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I don't think she'll reject you. But I could be wrong. Either way, you owe her the truth. And you owe yourself the chance to stop hiding." Then he was gone, leaving Kyle standing alone with a map in his hands and 5 years of excuses crumbling around him. Kyle couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed at the boarding house, listening to the wind pick up outside, and tried to imagine what facing Elena would actually look like. Would she be angry? Hurt? Would she even want to see him after all this time? Or had she truly moved on, built a life that no longer had space for a broken soldier who'd chosen cowardice over courage? The wooden bird was still in his pocket. He'd carried it every day since she'd given it to him, a talisman he couldn't bring himself to put down, even when he'd given up on everything it represented. Now he turned it over in his fingers, feeling the smooth surfaces she'd shaped with inexperienced hands, and remembered the look in her eyes when she'd asked him to come back. He'd made it back. Not in the condition he'd intended, not whole or capable or any of the things he'd thought she deserved, but he was alive. And he was here, and Garrett was right. She deserved to know. Deserved the chance to make her own choice instead of having Kyle make it for her. The decision solidified sometime around midnight. When dawn broke gray and cold, with the storm having passed in the night like Garrett predicted, Kyle was already dressed and packing his few belongings into saddlebags. Marcus found him in the stable, saddling a horse he'd borrowed from the livery. "You leaving?" "Yeah. I should have left 5 years ago." Marcus nodded slowly. "The woman Garrett mentioned?" "Elena. I left someone good behind, time I stopped making excuses about it." "Well," Marcus extended his hand. "Good luck. And Rourke? Whatever you think you can't do anymore, you're probably wrong. I've watched you adapt to that leg for 5 years. You're more capable than you give yourself credit for." Hale shook his hand, grateful for the kindness. Then he mounted up, feeling the familiar pull of his damaged knee, and pointed the horse south toward Red Mesa. The ride was harder than he'd anticipated. His body wasn't accustomed to long hours in the saddle anymore, and the injury made mounting and dismounting a painful, awkward process that left him gritting his teeth. But he pushed through, following Garrett's map, stopping only when absolutely necessary. The landscape shifted as he traveled, the green of Redemption's river valley giving way to scrubland, then gradually to the familiar red-tinted desert he remembered. Each mile closer made his heart pound harder, made the fear sharper. What if she slammed the door in his face? What if she'd married someone else? What if seeing him like this broke something in her he could never fix? But he kept riding because the alternative, going back to Redemption and spending the rest of his life wondering, was worse than any rejection she could deliver. He reached the ridge overlooking the Vance farm on the afternoon of the third day. The place looked the same: small house, barn, fields stretching toward the horizon. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant someone was home. Cale sat there for a long moment, gathering courage, then urged the horse down the slope. He was halfway to the house when the door opened and Elena stepped out. She'd changed, older, leaner, her hair now cut shorter in a practical style that suited her. She wore work clothes, an apron tied at her waist, and she was carrying a basket like she'd been about to head to the garden. But when she saw him, she stopped dead. Cale dismounted awkwardly, nearly losing his balance before his cane caught him. The look on Elena's face shifted from shock to something he couldn't quite read as he approached. "Hello, Elena." Her hand had gone to her mouth. "Kyle?" "Yeah, it's me." For a horrible moment, she just stared, and Cale braced himself for anger or tears or rejection. Instead, she dropped the basket and closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "You're alive." Her hands came up like she wanted to touch him but wasn't sure she was allowed. "You're actually alive." "I am. I know I should have—" "Shut up." Then she was kissing him, fierce and desperate, and somehow exactly like the last time. And Kale's cane clattered to the ground as he wrapped his arms around her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena's eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was looking at him like she was cataloging every change, every new scar and line of pain. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the way he was favoring his left side. "War injury. My knee's shot. I can walk but not well, and it hurts most days." "I don't care." "Elena, I don't care." She cupped his face in both hands. "You came back. That's all I asked for. I don't care if you're hurt or broken or different. You came back." "It took me 5 years." I noticed. There was an edge to her voice now, the anger finally surfacing. 5 years of wondering if you were dead. 5 years of not knowing if I should mourn or hope or move on. Do you have any idea what that was like? I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. I thought you deserved better than this." He gestured at himself, at the cane on the ground. "Better than a cripple who can't pull his weight." Elena's expression went cold. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare make that decision for me. I'm not trying to—" "Yes, you are. You decided I was too fragile or too shallow or too something to handle you being injured, and you stayed away. You made me wait 5 years, not knowing, not able to move forward or back, because you were too scared to let me see you weren't perfect anymore." Her voice cracked. "Did you really think so little of me? That I'd only want you if you were whole and useful? No, I just—" Cale tried to find words that wouldn't sound like excuses. "I couldn't bear the thought of becoming a burden, of you having to take care of me when you'd already given so much." "That's not your choice to make. You don't get to decide what I can handle or what I'm willing to carry. That's my decision, Kyle. Mine." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I would have helped you through anything, would have adapted to whatever you needed. But you didn't give me that chance. You just disappeared and left me with nothing but uncertainty and these pathetic letters that said nothing." The truth of her words gutted him. He'd been so focused on his own fear, his own shame, that he'd never stopped to consider what his absence was doing to her. He'd thought he was being noble. Instead, he'd been cruel. "You're right," he said quietly. "Everything you're saying is right. I was a coward, and I hurt you, and I don't have any excuse that makes it better." He bent painfully to retrieve his cane, needing something to hold on to. "I can't take back the last 5 years. Can't undo the damage. But I'm here now, and I'm asking you, begging you, to let me try to make it right." "How?" Elena's voice was raw. "How do you make this right?" "I don't know. I'll do whatever you need. Stay, go, grovel, give you space. Just tell me what you want." She laughed, a broken sound. "What I want? I want those 5 years back. I want to not have spent every single day wondering if you were alive or dead. I want to not have wasted all that time hoping when you'd already decided I wasn't worth coming home to." "That's not true. You were always worth it. I just couldn't see past my own fear." "Well, your fear cost us half a decade, Kyle. You realize that? 5 years we could have spent together, building something, and instead I got nothing but silence, and you got whatever the hell you were doing hiding in redemption." Thunder rumbled in the distance. Kyle looked up to see dark clouds rolling in fast, the kind of storm that came on quick and violent in Red Mesa. "I should go," he said, even though the thought of leaving now made him feel like he was being torn apart. "Let you think. I can find somewhere in town." "No." Elena's voice was firm. "You're not running again. We're going to have this out right now, even if it kills us both." The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold. Within seconds, it was a downpour, soaking them both. Elena didn't move, neither did Kale. "I'm damaged," he shouted over the sound of rain hammering the earth. "I can't work like I used to. Can't ride all day or lift heavy loads or any of the things that made me useful here. My leg is permanently ruined, and it's not getting better." "So what?" Elena shot back. "You think this farm needs you to be some perfect specimen? You think I need that?" "What do you need then?" "Tell me, because I sure as hell don't know anymore." "I need you to stop being so consumed by what you can't do that you miss what you can. I need you to trust me enough to be honest instead of making decisions behind my back. And I need you to understand that love isn't about what you can give me or how useful you are. It's about choosing each other even when it's hard, even when it's not perfect." Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating her face, and Kyle saw everything he'd been running from. The hurt he'd caused, the years he'd stolen, the future he'd almost thrown away because he couldn't accept that being broken didn't mean being worthless. "I love you," he said, the words ripped from somewhere deep. "I've loved you since before I left, and I never stopped. Not for a single day. But I'm terrified, Elena. Terrified that I'll need too much and give too little. Terrified that you'll wake up one day and regret settling for less than you deserve. You idiot." She closed the distance between them again, rain streaming down her face. "I'm not settling. I never was. I fell in love with you before the war, before the injury, when you were just some quiet man who worked too hard and kept too much locked inside. That hasn't changed. You're still that person, just with a limp and some scars." Her hands fisted in his wet shirt. "I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be here, present, honest, fighting for us instead of against yourself." "I don't know if I can be what you need." "Yes, you do. You're just too scared to try." She pulled him closer, her voice dropping but somehow still audible over the storm. "I waited 5 years, Kyle. 5 years of hoping and praying and refusing every other option because I knew that if you survived, you'd find your way back. And you did. You're here. So stop wasting both our time with excuses about what you can't do and tell me what you can do." Kyle looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same woman who'd sat with him in the barn all those years ago, the one who'd seen through every wall he built and refused to be pushed away. She was offering him everything he'd thought he'd lost. All he had to do was be brave enough to take it. "I can love you," he said. "I can show up every day and try. I can be honest even when it's hard. I can let you help me instead of pretending I don't need it. I can build a life here with you if you'll still have me, even though I'm not the man I was. I don't want the man you were. I want the man you are right now, standing in the rain, finally telling me the truth." Elena's expression softened. "Can you do that? Can you stay and let me see all of you? The strength and the weakness, the good days and the bad ones, everything?" The fear was still there, would probably always be there on some level. But looking at Elena, seeing the determination in her eyes, and the love she was offering despite everything he'd put her through, Kyle felt something else too. Hope. The fragile, terrifying kind that required trust and vulnerability and all the things that scared him most. "Yes," he said, "I can do that. Can do." She kissed him again, softer this time, and Kyle felt the last of his defenses crumble. He'd come home expecting rejection or conditional acceptance, prepared to beg for scraps if that's all she'd offer. Instead, Elena was demanding everything: his honesty, his trust, his broken pieces and jagged edges, and promising to meet him there with her own. When they finally made it inside, both soaked and shivering, Samuel was waiting. The old man looked Kyle up and down, taking in the cane and the limp and the years written on his face, then turned to Elena. "This the fool who's been hiding in redemption?" "That's him," Samuel grunted. "Took you long enough. Stable needs mucking and the irrigation system's still fighting me. You can start tomorrow, assuming you've got enough sense left to stay this time." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acceptance, and coming from Samuel, that meant something. Cale nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Get dried off," Samuel said gruffly. "Elena, make coffee. We've got some catching up to do, and I want to hear what kind of fool reasons kept this boy away for 5 years. Elena squeezed Cale's hand. "You sure you're ready for this?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." They sat around the kitchen table while the storm raged outside, and Kyle told them everything: the injury, the shame, the fear that had kept him away. The years in redemption convincing himself he was protecting Elena, when really he was just protecting himself from potential rejection. How Garrett had found him and called him on his cowardice until Kyle couldn't hide from it anymore. Samuel listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Kyle finished, the old man just shook his head. "You're an idiot." "I know. Could have saved everyone a lot of pain if you'd just come home and let us help you figure it out." "I know that too. But you're here now." Samuel stood, joints creaking. "That counts for something. Tomorrow we'll see what you can still do and work around what you can't. Farm needs hands more than it needs perfection." After Samuel retreated to his room, Kyle and Elena sat in the quiet kitchen, the storm outside finally starting to ease. "I'm going to mess this up," Kyle said. "Not on purpose, but I will. There will be days the pain is bad, and I'm not good company. Days where I forget to ask for help when I need it, or push myself too hard trying to prove I'm still useful. I know. And there will probably be times I fall back into old patterns, times where I try to pull away or convince myself I'm a burden. Might take a while to break those habits. I know that too." Elena laced her fingers through his. "I'm not expecting perfection, Kyle. I'm expecting you to try, to stay when it's hard, to let me in instead of shutting me out. Can you do that?" "I'll do my best. That's all I'm asking." She stood, tugging him to his feet. "Come on. You're dead on your feet, and we've got years to make up for. We can start tomorrow." Kyle let her lead him to the small room off the kitchen that used to be his, finding it exactly as he'd left it 5 years ago, except cleaner, like someone had been maintaining it, hoping. "You kept it ready," he said softly. "Of course I did. I told you I'd wait." Elena paused in the doorway. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next." After she left, Kyle sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pulled out the wooden bird. It was worn smooth from years of handling, the details less sharp than when she'd first given it to him. But it was still recognizable, still the symbol of home she'd intended it to be. He'd made it back. Not the way he'd planned, not whole or victorious or any of the things he'd imagined when he first left. But he was here, and Elena still wanted him, and for the first time in 5 years, Kyle let himself believe that maybe being broken wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was just the beginning of a different one. Morning came too early and with too much light. Kale woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee, his body protesting every movement as he tried to sit up. The ride from redemption had left him stiff in ways he hadn't been in years, and his knee felt like someone had driven railroad spikes through it. He forced himself upright anyway, reaching for the cane propped against the wall. The alternative was lying there feeling sorry for himself, and he'd already wasted 5 years on that particular indulgence. Elena was at the stove when he limped into the kitchen, her back to him as she worked. She'd braided her hair again, he noticed, the way she used to wear it when they worked together. The sight of it made something in his chest ache. "Coffee's hot," she said without turning around. "How's the leg?" "Functional." "That's not what I asked." Cale poured himself a cup, using the counter for support. "Hurts. But it always hurts. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be used to pain." She finally looked at him, and her expression was softer than her words. "But I'm glad you're honest about it, at least." Samuel came in from outside, tracking mud across the floor Elena had probably cleaned an hour ago. He looked at Kyle with the same assessing gaze from the night before. You eat breakfast, then I'll show you what needs doing. See what you can manage. It wasn't a challenge exactly, but it wasn't quite acceptance either. Kyle nodded and sat down to the plate Elena set in front of him. Eggs, bacon, bread that was still warm from the oven. Real food, the kind he'd gotten used to going without. They ate in relative silence, the kind that used to feel comfortable but now carried weight. There was too much unsaid, too many years of absence sitting between them, like a wall that needed dismantling brick by brick. After breakfast, Samuel led Kyle outside. The farm looked different in daylight, older, more worn than Kyle remembered. Fences that needed mending, equipment that showed signs of makeshift repairs, fields that could use more hands than two people could provide. Place has seen better days, Samuel said, following Kyle's gaze. Lost one of the wells 2 years back. Had to reroute everything, but it's never worked quite right since. And the north pasture fence keeps falling down every time we get wind. Where do you want me to start? That depends on what you can do. It was a fair question. Kyle looked at the barn, the fields, the endless list of work a farm required, and tried to assess himself honestly. He couldn't ride all day anymore. Couldn't lift heavy loads or work on his feet for extended periods. Couldn't do half the things that had made him valuable before. I can do detail work, he said finally. Things that require hands more than strength. I can plan, organize, figure out systems. I know enough about irrigation from the war. We had to set up water systems in some rough terrain, and I can still shoot straight if you've got problems with predators. Samuel considered this. The irrigation system's been giving me fits. Can't get the water where it needs to go, and I can't figure out why. You think you could look at it? I can try. They spent the morning walking the irrigation lines, Kyle moving slowly but methodically, checking connections and water flow, while Samuel explained what he'd already attempted. The problem became clear fairly quickly. The original system had been designed for different field layouts, and Samuel's modifications had created pressure issues that were causing some areas to flood while others stayed dry. You need to add a regulator here, Kyle said, pointing to a junction point. And this line needs to be split before it reaches the north field. The elevation change is working against you. Can you do that? Yeah, it'll take a few days and I'll need help with the digging, but I can design it and do the fitting work. Something shifted in Samuel's expression, not quite approval, but a loosening of the reserve he'd been holding. All right, we'll start tomorrow. Today you should probably rest before that leg gives out entirely. I can keep working. I wasn't asking. Samuel's tone was firm, but not unkind. You show up pushing yourself too hard and useless by noon, or you pace yourself and stay functional. Your choice, but I know which one makes more sense. It was the kind of logic Kyle couldn't argue with, much as he wanted to. He nodded stiffly and made his way back to the house, hating that he had to concede the point, but knowing Samuel was right. Elena was in the garden, working between rows of vegetables that looked healthier than anything Kyle had managed to grow in Redemption. She sat back on her heels when she saw him, wiping dirt from her hands. Done already? Your father suggested I pace myself. Smart man. She stood, brushing off her skirt. Walk with me? They made a slow circuit of the property, Elena adjusting her stride to match his without making it obvious. She pointed out changes, the new chicken coop, the vegetable garden expansion, the tree she'd planted the year after he left that was now taller than she was. I kept busy, she said. Figured if I stopped moving, I'd fall apart. So I just kept working, kept building, kept making this place better even though I didn't know if you'd ever see it. I'm sorry I wasn't here to help. I know you are. You've said it about a dozen times now. She stopped walking, turning to face him. But apologies don't actually change anything, Kyle. What matters is what you do now. What do you need me to do? I need you to stop treating yourself like you're already dead. Her bluntness was startling. I need you to stop waiting for me to realize you're not worth the trouble and leave. And I need you to understand that building a life together means actually being present for it, not just existing in the same space. The words landed hard because they were true. Even now, even after coming back, part of Kyle was still holding himself separate, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Elena to wake up and see him clearly and decide he wasn't enough. I don't know how to do that, he admitted. don't know how to just be here without waiting for it to end. You practice. Same way you learn to walk again after the injury. You try, you fail, you get back up, and try again. Elena's hand found his. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for effort. Can you give me that? Yeah, I can do that. Good. Then let's start with dinner. I'm making stew, and you're going to sit at that table and tell me about redemption, the real version, not the sanitized one you put in your letters. I want to know what the last 5 years looked like for you. It was harder than Kyle expected, laying out the reality of his exile in redemption. The boarding house that smelled like mildew and old cooking. The feed store job that paid enough to survive but not enough to feel like living. The long evenings sitting alone in his room, convincing himself he was doing the right thing while every letter from Elena carved another piece out of his chest. I told myself I was protecting you, he said, staring into his stew, that you deserved better than a cripple who couldn't pull his weight. But really, I was just scared. Scared you'd see me like this and realize I wasn't worth the trouble. Easier to stay away and keep the memory of what we had than risk destroying it by coming back broken. You know what I did the first year after you stopped writing? Elena asked. I convinced myself you were dead, mourned you, tried to move on. Then someone mentioned seeing a disabled veteran in Redemption who matched your description, and I realized you weren't dead. You'd just decided I wasn't worth coming back to. That hurt worse than thinking you'd died. The pain in her voice was visceral. Kyle had spent so much time focused on his own fear and shame that he'd never really let himself think about what his absence was doing to her. He told himself she'd be better off, that she'd move on and find someone whole. Instead, he'd left her in limbo, unable to grieve or heal or move forward. I can't take it back, he said quietly. Can't give you those years. All I can do is try to make the time we have left count for something. Then do that. Stop apologizing and start showing up. Over the following weeks, Kyle settled into a routine that felt both familiar and strange. He worked on the irrigation system with Samuel, spending hours planning and fitting while the old man did the heavy digging. It wasn't the kind of physical labor Kyle was used to, but it was useful work that required knowledge and precision, things his injury hadn't taken from him. Elena worked alongside them when she could, her presence a constant reminder of what he'd almost lost. They didn't talk much during the day, but the silences were comfortable again, filled with the sound of work and the desert wind. Evenings were harder. That's when the gap of 5 years felt widest, when they had to figure out how to be around each other without the buffer of tasks and exhaustion. They'd sit on the porch after dinner, and Kyle would catch himself watching Elena the way he used to, then remember that things weren't the same, couldn't be the same, after what he'd done. You're doing it again, Elena said one night. Doing what? Treating me like I'm fragile, like you have to be careful around me or I'll break. She set down her mending and looked at him directly. I'm angry with you, Kyle. Not all the time, and not in a way that makes me want you gone. But I'm angry that you stole 5 years from us because you were too proud or too scared to let me make my own choices. And I need you to let me be angry about that instead of trying to fix it. The honesty was bracing. All right, be angry. I am. And I'm also relieved you're back and scared you'll leave again and frustrated that we have to rebuild trust that shouldn't have been broken in the first place. She picked up her mending again, fingers moving with practiced ease. It's complicated. We're complicated, and that's just how it's going to be for a while. How long is a while? I don't know, as long as it takes. She glanced at him. Does that scare you? A little. Good. It should. We're not picking up where we left off, Kyle. We're starting something new, and that means working through the mess we're in instead of pretending it doesn't exist. It was a fair assessment, and it aligned with what Garrett had said, that loving someone meant showing up for the hard parts, not just the easy ones. Kyle had run from the hard parts for 5 years. Time to prove he could do better. The irrigation system took 3 weeks to fix properly. By the time they finished, Kyle's hands were covered in new calluses, and his knee was a constant source of pain, but water was flowing where it needed to, and the fields were responding. Samuel stood back, surveying their work with something that might have been satisfaction. That'll do. Should hold through next season at least. It'll hold longer than that if you maintain it properly. Then I guess you'll have to stick around and make sure I do it right. It was the closest Samuel had come to actually saying Kyle was welcome. and the old man's acceptance meant more than Kyle could articulate. He just nodded, throat tight, and gathered his tools. That evening, a rider came from town with news that spread through the community like wildfire. The Hendersons' youngest boy had gone missing. 7 years old, wandered off from the family homestead that afternoon, and hadn't been seen since. With night falling and temperatures dropping, every able-bodied person was being called to help search. "I'll go," Elena said immediately, already moving to get supplies. Samuel nodded. "I'll ride to the Martins' place, get them organized." "Kyle—" "I'll come," Kyle said. Both of them looked at him, and Kyle could see the calculation happening. A search meant rough terrain, long hours on horseback, exactly the kind of physical demand his body couldn't handle anymore. "You sure?" Samuel asked carefully. "I can't ride all day, but I can organize search patterns, figure out likely routes based on terrain and where the boy was last seen. Someone needs to coordinate so you're not all searching the same areas." Samuel considered this, then nodded. "All right. You work from the Henderson place. Keep track of who's searching where and make sure we're covering ground systematically." They rode out together, Elena and Samuel joining the dozens of people converging on the Henderson homestead. The parents were frantic, the mother in tears, the father trying to hold himself together while organizing the search efforts and clearly failing at both. Kyle took one look at the chaos and started giving orders. "We need a map. Someone get me paper and something to write with." He turned to the Henderson boy's father. "Where was he last seen? What was he doing? Was he playing or heading somewhere specific?" The father pulled himself together enough to answer. "Playing near the creek. Said he was looking for interesting rocks. My wife called him for dinner, and he didn't come." "What's the terrain like between here and the creek?" "Scrubland mostly, some rocky outcroppings. Creek runs through a small canyon about a mile west." Kyle sketched out a rough map based on the description, marking the homestead, the creek, and major terrain features people mentioned. Then he started dividing the area into search zones. "U6, take this section along the creek bed. Move slow. Check every hiding spot. Kids get scared and tuck themselves into small spaces. U4, sweep this area north of the homestead in case he got turned around. And I need 2 experienced trackers heading west toward that canyon. If he followed the creek, that's where he'd end up." People moved immediately, grateful to have clear direction. Elena caught his eye before she left with her assigned group, something like pride in her expression. Then she was gone into the gathering dark. Kyle stayed at the homestead, coordinating as search parties reported back and new ones headed out. His knee was screaming from standing, but he ignored it, focused on the map and the growing grid of searched areas. 2 hours passed with no sign of the boy. Then one of the trackers came back, moving fast. "Found tracks heading into the canyon. Fresh, small. Could be him." "How far?" "1.5 miles. The canyon's rough, though, narrow in places, lots of drop-offs. If he's in there and it's dark..." Kyle understood the implication. A child lost in rough terrain at night could easily fall, get hurt, become impossible to find until morning. And with temperatures dropping, morning might be too late. "I need someone who knows that canyon and isn't afraid of heights," Kyle said. "I know it," a man volunteered. "Hunted there for years." "Good. Take 3 people with you and take ropes. If you find him injured, send one person back for the doctor while the others stay with him. And for the love of everything, be careful. We don't need more people hurt." They headed out, and Kyle updated his map, marking the canyon area and the search pattern. Elena's group came back, reported their section clear, and Kyle redirected them to cover ground closer to the homestead in case the boy had circled back. Another hour passed. The Henderson parents were beyond frantic now. The mother convinced her son was dead, the father pacing like a caged animal. Kyle kept his voice calm and steady, providing updates, maintaining the illusion of control even though his own stomach was churning. Then a shout went up from the west. One of the canyon searchers, running back at full speed. "Found him! He's alive!" The relief was palpable. The mother collapsed, sobbing. The father stood frozen for a moment, then grabbed Kyle's shoulder, hard enough to bruise. "Thank you, thank you. I don't know what we would have done without—" "Thank the searchers," Kyle interrupted. "They're the ones who found him. I just kept track of where people were." But as the boy was brought back, cold and scared but uninjured beyond some scrapes, and the community gathered around to celebrate the happy ending, Kyle felt something shift. People kept looking at him differently. not with pity for his limp or awkwardness about his injury, but with respect. Samuel noticed it too. On the ride back to the farm, he said, "You did good work tonight, kept everyone organized when they were ready to panic. That Henderson boy is alive because you kept your head. Anyone could have done it." "But they didn't. You did." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "I know you think that injury made you useless, but what I saw tonight was someone who knows how to lead, how to think under pressure, how to use his experience to solve problems. That's worth more than being able to lift heavy things." The words settled into Kael's chest, a counterweight to years of thinking his worth was tied to his physical capability. He'd organized the search from a place of knowledge and experience, things the war had taught him, skills his injury hadn't touched. And it had mattered, had maybe saved a child's life. Elena was waiting when they got home, already having heard the news. She met Kael at the door, and this time when she looked at him, there was something new in her expression. "I heard what you did, how you kept everyone coordinated, made sure they weren't wasting effort. It needed doing." "Yes, it did, and you did it." She stepped closer. "You saved that boy's life tonight, Kael. Maybe not by finding him yourself, but by making sure the people who could find him were in the right place. That matters." "I know. Do you?" "Because I've watched you for weeks now, moving around like you're apologizing for taking up space. But what you did tonight, that's who you are. Someone who solves problems, who leads, who makes a difference even when the circumstances aren't ideal." Her hand came up to rest over his heart. "Your body might be damaged, but your mind is sharp, and your courage is intact. When are you going to start believing that's enough?" Kael didn't have an answer, but standing there with Elena looking at him like he was someone worth believing in, feeling the respect of a community that had seen him contribute something valuable, he felt the first real stirring of possibility. Maybe being useful didn't require being whole. Maybe there were other ways to matter, other ways to build a life worth living. "I'm trying," he said finally. "I know, and I can see it's working." Elena smiled, and it was the first fully unguarded smile she'd given him since he came back. "Keep trying. You're getting there." Word of the Henderson rescue spread. People who'd previously looked at Kael with polite distance or awkward sympathy started nodding in acknowledgement when they saw him in town. The Henderson father made a point of shaking his hand and telling anyone who'd listen that Kael was the reason his son was alive. It was uncomfortable at first. Kael wasn't used to being seen as anything other than damaged. But gradually, he started to accept that maybe there was space for both things to be true. He could be injured and still capable, damaged and still valuable, broken and still worth something. The real test came when the town council approached him. "We've been talking," Councilman Morrison said. "No relation to the colonel, just unfortunate naming. About setting up a proper emergency response system. Way things are now, when something goes wrong, we scramble and hope for the best. But someone with experience, someone who knows how to organize people and coordinate efforts, that could save lives." "What are you asking?" "We want you to put together a plan. How to respond to fires, medical emergencies, lost children, whatever crisis might come up. And when something does happen, we want you to help coordinate the response." Morrison shifted his weight. "It wouldn't pay much, but it's important work. And you've proven you're good at it." Kael looked at the man, then at Elena, who was waiting nearby, then back at Morrison. A year ago, even a month ago, he would have said no. Would have made excuses about his injury, about not being qualified, about someone else being better suited. But he was trying to be different now. Trying to believe that what he could offer mattered, even if it wasn't what he used to be capable of. "All right," he said. "I'll do it." Elena's smile when he told her was brighter than the desert sun. "I'm proud of you." "I haven't done anything yet." "Yes, you have. You said yes. You stopped hiding behind your injury and accepted that you have something to contribute." She kissed him, quick and sure. "That's everything." Over the next months, Kael built the emergency response plan, drawing on his military experience and adapting it for civilian needs. He trained volunteers, established supply caches, created maps marking resources and potential hazards. It was detailed, methodical work that played to his strengths and didn't require physical capabilities he no longer had. And slowly, gradually, Kael started to feel like he belonged. Not as the man he used to be, but as the person he was becoming, someone who'd survived being broken and was learning to build something new from the pieces that remained. He and Elena were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of fire, when she said, "I've been thinking." About? About us? About what comes next? She turned to look at him. "I'm not ready yet. To fully trust that you won't run again, to believe this is permanent. But I'm getting there, and I thought you should know that." "Thank you for telling me. I also thought you should know that I still love you. Even when I'm angry or scared or uncertain, that hasn't changed." Kale reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I love you too, and I know I have to earn back the trust I broke. I'm willing to do that work, however long it takes." "Good." Elena leaned against him, fitting into the space she'd always occupied. "Because I'm planning on a future with you, K.L. Rourke, and I need you to be planning on the same thing. Not running at the first sign of trouble, not deciding for me what I can handle, actually staying and building something together. I can do that. Promise me." He thought about the promises he'd made before. To come back from the war, to be the man she deserved, all the ways he'd failed to keep his word. But this promise felt different. Not because success was guaranteed, but because he was finally understanding what it meant to actually try. "I promise," he said. "I'm here, and I'm staying. Whatever comes, we face it together." Elena lifted her head to kiss him, and Kael kissed her back, tasting salt and sunset and the future they were slowly, carefully building. It wasn't perfect. There would be hard days ahead, moments where old fears surfaced or new challenges tested them. But they were here, together, choosing each other despite the damage. And for the first time since the bullet had shattered his knee and his assumptions about his own worth, Kael believed that might actually be enough. The proposal came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, which felt appropriate somehow. Grand gestures had never been Kael's style, and after everything they'd been through, ordinary felt like the most honest thing he could offer. They were working in the garden, Elena weeding between rows of tomatoes, while Kael repaired the fence that kept the rabbits out. His knee was having a decent day, pain present but manageable, and the early morning air hadn't yet turned brutal with heat. "I've been thinking," Kael said, not looking up from the post he was securing. "Dangerous habit. About us. About what we're building here." He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I know we said we'd take things slow, that you needed time to trust I wasn't going to run again, and I respect that. But I also think there's a difference between being cautious and being afraid to move forward." Elena sat back on her heels, studying him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to marry you, not because I think it'll fix what I broke or because I'm trying to rush past the hard parts, but because I know what I want my life to look like, and it looks like this. You and me, working together, building something that matters." He pulled the wooden bird from his pocket, worn smooth from years of handling. "You gave me this and told me to come back. I did, eventually. Now I'm asking if you'll let me stay permanently, not just on the farm, but in your life, as your husband." The silence stretched long enough that Kael started to worry he'd miscalculated, pushed too hard too soon. Then Elena stood, brushing dirt from her hands, and crossed to where he was standing. "Ask me properly," she said. "What?" "You just made a statement. I want you to actually ask." Kael's mouth twitched despite his nerves. "You're going to make me get down on one knee, aren't you, with this leg?" "Yes." "You're cruel. I'm practical. If you can't manage it now, how are you going to handle the hard days ahead?" But her eyes were soft, and Kael could see she was testing something, not his physical ability, but his willingness to be vulnerable, to risk looking foolish or weak in service of something that mattered. He handed her his cane and lowered himself carefully to his good knee, the damaged one protesting every inch of the way. It was awkward and ungraceful and probably looked ridiculous, but Elena was watching him like he'd just done something impossibly brave. "Elena Vance," he said, looking up at her. "Will you marry me?" "Yes." No hesitation, no qualifications, just yes. Kael tried to stand and nearly fell over. Elena caught him, laughing, and they ended up in an undignified heap in the garden dirt, kissing and grinning like fools. "That was terrible," Elena said against his mouth. "Most awkward proposal in history. You're the one who demanded proper form." "I know. It was perfect." She pulled back enough to look at him seriously. I mean it, KL. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. I'll take the good days and the bad ones and everything in between. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the farm. Samuel officiated. He'd been granted the authority years ago and had performed marriages for half the county. Garrett rode in from wherever he'd been stationed, along with a handful of other veterans Kael had served with. The Henderson family came, and most of the town council, and enough neighbors to fill the yard. Elena wore a simple dress the color of desert sage, her hair braided with wildflowers. Kael wore the only decent clothes he owned and tried not to lean too obviously on his cane. When Samuel asked if he took Elena as his wife, Kael's voice was steady. I do. And do you, Elena, take this man, broken parts, stubborn pride, and all, to be your husband? Elena's smile was brilliant. I do. Absolutely. They celebrated with food and music and the kind of community gathering that reminded Kael why small towns mattered. People who'd known each other for decades, who showed up when things got hard, who made space for broken soldiers and gave them a chance to prove they were more than their injuries. Late in the evening, after most people had left, Garrett found Kael sitting on the porch. You did it, Garrett said, settling into the chair beside him. Actually went through with it. You sound surprised. A little. Last time I saw you, you were convinced you didn't deserve her. I'm still not sure I do. But I'm done letting fear make my decisions. Kael watched Elena through the window, laughing at something Samuel had said. She chose me. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. Garrett was quiet for a moment. You know what you did, right? Coming back here, facing all of it, that took more courage than anything you did in the war. I don't know about that. I do. It's easy to be brave when you're fighting an enemy you can see. Harder when you're fighting yourself. Garrett stood, clapping Kael on the shoulder. I'm glad you won. After Garrett left, Elena came out to join him. She'd taken down her hair and kicked off her shoes, looking more relaxed than Kael had seen her in months. Happy? She asked, settling into his lap despite the chair not really being big enough for both of them. Yeah, you? Very. She rested her head on his shoulder. Though I should warn you, Margaret Henderson cornered me earlier with very pointed questions about when we're planning to have children. What'd you tell her? That it's none of her business, but also that we're not ruling it out. Elena tilted her head to look at him. We're not, are we? Ruling it out? Kael thought about it. A year ago, even 6 months ago, the idea of bringing children into his broken existence would have seemed impossible. But now, with Elena warm against him and a future that felt tangible instead of theoretical, he could imagine it. Could picture a small person with Elena's determination and maybe his stubbornness, learning to work the land and build things that lasted. No, he said, we're not ruling it out. Good. Because I think you'd make a good father, patient, thoughtful, willing to let people make their own mistakes and learn from them. You're describing yourself. Then we'll both be good at it. She kissed him softly. But not tonight. Tonight I just want to enjoy being married to you. The first year of marriage was an education in compromise and communication. They had to learn each other's rhythms again, figure out how to navigate shared space and shared decisions. Elena had lived alone with Samuel for 5 years. She'd developed her own systems, her own ways of doing things. Kael had spent the same time in isolation, building walls that were hard to dismantle even when he wanted them gone. They fought sometimes. Not often, but when they did, it was usually about Kael reverting to old patterns, taking on too much without asking for help, hiding when the pain got bad instead of admitting he needed rest, making decisions unilaterally because he was trying to avoid being a burden. We're partners, Elena said after one particularly frustrating argument about Kael attempting to repair the barn roof alone despite his knee being in bad shape. That means you don't get to protect me from reality by doing stupid things that might get you killed. I'd rather have you alive and occasionally needing help than dead because you were too proud to admit you have limitations. I wasn't trying to... Yes, you were. You're always trying to prove you're not damaged, that you can still do everything yourself. But here's the thing, Kael. I already know you're damaged. We both are. That's not new information, and it doesn't change how I feel about you. What does change things is when you lie to me about how you're doing or take unnecessary risks, because you're still fighting against accepting what is. She was right, and Kael knew it. The patterns ran deep, though. Decades of learning that vulnerability was dangerous, that needing help was weakness, that his value was tied to what he could do rather than who he was. Unlearning all of that didn't happen overnight, but he tried. When his knee was bad, he told her instead of hiding it. When a task was beyond his current capability, he asked for help or figured out a different approach instead of pushing through and making things worse. Slowly, incrementally, he started to believe that Elena meant what she said, that she loved him as he was, not as some idealized version he'd never be again. The emergency response system he'd built proved its worth when fire broke out at the mill. Cale was home when the alarm went up, a bell system they'd installed that could be heard across the valley. He grabbed his cane and the emergency kit, shouting for Elena to get the medical supplies while he headed for the mill. By the time he arrived, smoke was already pouring from the building and workers were scrambling in controlled panic. Kyle took one look at the chaos and started organizing. You 6, bucket brigade from the creek. You 4, get everyone accounted for and make sure no one's trapped inside. Someone ride for the doctor in case we have injuries. And I need 2 people to clear that equipment away from the building before the fire spreads to it. The training kicked in. People moved to their assigned tasks without argument, and within minutes, they had a coordinated response instead of panicked confusion. The fire was contained before it could spread to other structures, and when they finally got it under control, only the mill itself was lost. No casualties, no injuries beyond minor burns and smoke inhalation. The mill owner, a man named Chester Brown, found Cale afterward. You saved my life's work from being a total loss. If that fire had spread to the lumberyard or the storage buildings, just doing what needed doing. It's more than that. You kept everyone safe, kept property damage minimal, and you did it all without being able to run or carry water or do any of the physical work yourself. Chester shook his head in wonder. That's leadership. That's knowing how to use what you have instead of mourning what you've lost. The word stayed with Kyle. For so long, he'd focused on what the injury had taken from him, his mobility, his strength, his ability to work the way he used to. But the fire had proven something important. His value didn't come from physical capability. It came from knowledge, experience, the ability to think clearly under pressure and organize resources effectively. He could still contribute, still matter, just in different ways than before. Elena was waiting when he got home, having heard about the fire from neighbors. She took one look at him, covered in soot, exhausted, but fundamentally all right, and pulled him into a fierce hug. You're okay? I'm fine. Knee's angry at me for standing so long, but nothing serious. You saved the mill. I coordinated the response. Other people did the actual saving. Stop diminishing what you did. She pulled back to look at him. You just proved that who you are matters more than what you can physically do. When are you going to start believing that? I'm working on it. Work faster, because I'm tired of watching you doubt yourself when everyone else can see what I've always known, that you're remarkable exactly as you are. 2 years into their marriage, Elena told him she was pregnant. Cale was in the barn when she found him, repairing a saddle that had seen better days. She stood in the doorway, backlit by late afternoon sun, and there was something in her expression that made his hands still. I'm pregnant, she said simply, about 8 weeks along, according to the doctor. The world seemed to stop. Kyle set down the leather he'd been working on, his mind struggling to process what she'd just said. You're sure? Very sure. Elena moved closer, and he could see she was nervous, excited but nervous, probably worried about how he'd react. I know we talked about it being a possibility, but now that it's real, I'm terrified, Kyle admitted, and happy and completely unprepared, but mostly terrified. Me too. She took his hands. But we'll figure it out, same way we figured out everything else. What if I can't? Cale's throat tightened. What if I can't keep up? Can't do the things a father should do because of this leg? Then we'll adapt, same way we always do. Elena's grip tightened. Your father didn't have a damaged knee, and he still failed you in every way that mattered. This baby isn't going to care if you can run or climb or do any of that. They're going to care that you show up, that you love them, that you teach them how to be a good person, and those things you can absolutely do. The pregnancy was harder than either of them expected. Elena was sick for months, exhausted in a way that worried both her and Kyle. The doctor assured them it was normal, that some women just had difficult pregnancies, but watching her struggle was its own kind of torture. Kyle took over more of the household work, learning to cook properly instead of just making do, managing the garden and the animals while Elena rested. Samuel helped when he could, but the old man was slowing down himself, his joints giving him more trouble with each passing year. "I'm useless," Elena said one afternoon, frustrated with her own body's betrayal. "Can't work, can't hardly get out of bed some days. You married me for my strength and I've got none left." "I married you because I love you, and you're growing a whole human being right now. That takes strength I can't even imagine." Kyle settled beside her on the bed, handing her the tea that sometimes helped with the nausea. "Besides, now you know what it feels like to have your body not cooperate with what your mind wants to do. Welcome to my world." She laughed despite herself. "I'm sorry, I know you deal with this every day, and you've never once made me feel like I was less because of it. So I'm returning the favor." Their daughter was born on a freezing night in January, arriving 3 weeks early and screaming her displeasure at the world from her first breath. They named her Sarah, after Elena's mother, and she had dark hair like both of them, and a stubborn streak that showed up before she was a week old. Kyle held her for the first time and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This small, fragile person was depending on him, not for his ability to lift heavy things or work all day without rest, but for care and protection and guidance, for love. "You're crying," Elena said softly from the bed, exhausted but smiling. "Am I?" Kyle wiped his face with his free hand, not taking his eyes off Sarah. "I didn't notice." "You're going to be a wonderful father." "I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I. We'll learn together." Sarah didn't care about Kyle's limp. When she was fussy, she settled just as easily in his arms as Elena's. When she learned to crawl, she'd pull herself up using his cane as much as furniture, seeing it as just another part of the landscape. And when she took her first steps, it was toward Kyle, reaching for him with complete faith that he'd catch her. Which he did, nearly falling over in the process, but managing to stay upright through sheer determination. "That's my girl," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Brave like your mother." "Stubborn like her father," Elena corrected, laughing. "Look at her. She knows what she wants and she's going for it." Watching Sarah grow, Kale started to understand something Elena had been trying to tell him for years. His value as a person, as a husband, as a father, it wasn't measured by what he could do physically. It was measured by how he showed up, by the love and care and patience he offered, by the example he set. Sarah would never know him as the man he'd been before the war. To her, he'd always been the father with the limp and the cane, the one who thought through problems instead of overpowering them, who taught her that strength came in many forms, and that being different didn't mean being less. When Sarah was 2, disaster struck in a way none of them had anticipated. The creek that ran through Henderson property, the same one where their boy had gotten lost years ago, flooded during an unusually heavy storm. The water rose fast, faster than anyone expected, and within hours it was threatening several homesteads downstream. Kale was coordinating the emergency response from the town hall, tracking which families had evacuated and which were still at risk, when word came that the Henderson boy, now 9 years old, had gone back to the house to rescue the family dog and hadn't come out. "The water's too high," the messenger said, breathing hard from his run. "House is surrounded. His father tried to get to him, but the current's too strong." Kyle looked at his map, calculating. The Henderson place was a quarter-mile from the main road, accessible by a path that was probably underwater by now. Standard approach would be impossible, but there was a ridge that ran parallel to the creek, higher ground that might still be passable. "I need a horse, and someone who knows that ridge," Kyle said. "And rope. Lots of rope." "You can't go," Elena said. She'd come to the town hall to help coordinate supplies, and now she was looking at Kyle like she knew exactly what he was thinking. "Kyle, with your leg, in that water. I'm not going in the water, but I can get close enough to throw a line, and I know how to set anchor points. The boy trusts me. He'll listen if I tell him what to do." "Someone else can go." "Who?" "Everyone with the skill is already out evacuating families or reinforcing the levees. I'm here, I'm trained for this, and that boy saved my life once just by being worth rescuing. I owe him." Elena's jaw tightened, but she knew he was right. "Then I'm coming with you." Elena, Sarah's with my father. You need someone to help with the ropes, and you can't do it alone. I'm coming. They rode out together, following the ridge as rain continued to pour down. The path was treacherous, mud making the footing uncertain, but the horse was sure-footed, and they made it to a point overlooking the Henderson house. The situation was worse than Kyle had imagined. The house was an island in rushing water, surrounded on all sides by currents strong enough to sweep a grown man away. He could see the boy in a second-story window, holding a small dog, and clearly terrified. "Thomas," Kale shouted over the sound of the water. "Can you hear me?" The boy's head snapped up. "Mr. Rourke? I'm going to get you out, but you need to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." Kale turned to Elena. "We need to anchor the rope to that tree and get the other end close enough for him to catch. The current's going to fight us, but if we can create a safety line, he can use it to get to higher ground." They worked quickly, tying off the rope and weighing the throwing end with a rock wrapped in cloth. Kale's knee was screaming at him from the ride and the awkward positioning, but he ignored it, focused on the physics of angle and distance. The first throw fell short. The second went wide. On the third attempt, the weighted end landed on the roof near Thomas's window. "Grab it," Kale shouted. "Tie it around your waist, under your arms. Make sure the dog is secure." The boy fumbled with the rope, and Kale held his breath while Thomas worked. Finally, the boy gave a thumbs up. "When I tell you, jump into the water and let the current take you. The rope will swing you toward the bank. You understand?" "I'm scared." "I know, but you've done scary things before. Remember when you got lost in the canyon? You made it through that." Thomas nodded, clutching the dog tighter. "On three, 1, 2, 3. The boy jumped. For a horrible moment, the current grabbed him, and Kale thought they'd miscalculated, that the force would be too much. But the rope held, swinging Thomas in an arc toward the bank where Elena was waiting. She grabbed him as he came close, hauling him and the dog onto solid ground. The relief was overwhelming. Kyle sagged against the tree he'd been using for support, his leg finally giving out entirely. Elena was there immediately, helping him to his feet, while Thomas stood dripping and shivering, but alive. "You saved me again," the boy said, voice shaking. "You saved yourself. You just needed someone to give you a way out." Kyle ruffled the kid's wet hair. "Now let's get you back to your parents before they lose their minds." The ride back was slower, Thomas riding with Elena while Kyle followed, his body protesting every movement. By the time they reached town, news had already spread. The Henderson parents were there, crying and thanking him, and other people were gathering to hear what had happened. "He risked his life," Mr. Henderson was saying. "Went out there with that bad leg of his and saved my boy when no one else could get close." "I didn't risk my life," Kyle corrected, accepting the blanket someone wrapped around his shoulders. "I used knowledge and planning to solve a problem. Elena did the actual physical work." But people weren't listening to his attempts to deflect. They were looking at him the way they'd looked at him after the first rescue, after the fire, with respect that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with what he'd actually accomplished. Later, after they'd gotten home and changed into dry clothes, Elena found Kyle sitting with Sarah, who'd fallen asleep in his lap. "You scared me today," she said quietly. "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just be careful. I need you here, and so does she." Elena gestured at their sleeping daughter. "You're not expendable, Kale. You don't have to keep proving you're worth something by risking yourself." "I wasn't trying to prove anything. That boy needed help." "I know, and I'm proud of you for helping. I just need you to remember that being brave doesn't mean being reckless. You have people who need you to come home." Kyle looked down at Sarah, her small hand fisted in his shirt even in sleep. "I'll remember." The years that followed were quieter. Sarah grew from a toddler into a curious, energetic child who asked endless questions and got into everything. Samuel passed peacefully in his sleep when she was 4, and they buried him on the property he'd loved, beneath the desert sun that had been his constant companion. Elena grieved hard but privately, the way she did most things. Kyle held her through it, offering the same steady presence she'd given him countless times. And they moved forward because that's what you did. You survived the losses, and you kept building. The farm thrived under their combined management. Elena handled the day-to-day operations while Kyle managed planning and systems. Their different strengths complementing each other in ways that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts. They added livestock, expanded the fields, modernized the irrigation system beyond what Kyle had originally built. The emergency response system became formalized, with Kyle training a whole team of coordinators so the town wasn't dependent on any single person. He taught them everything he knew: how to assess situations quickly, how to organize resources, how to keep people calm when panic was the easier option. "You're building a legacy," Elena said one evening, watching him work with a group of younger volunteers. "Something that'll outlast us. Just trying to make sure people are prepared. You're doing more than that. You're teaching them that limitations don't have to be disabilities, that there are multiple ways to contribute, that value isn't measured by physical strength alone." She smiled. "Sarah's watching, learning from you. She told me yesterday that she wants to be like you when she grows up, smart and brave and good at helping people." The words hit Cale square in the chest. For so long, he'd worried about what kind of example he was setting, whether his daughter would see his limitations and think less of him. Instead, she saw his adaptations and learned from them, saw him continue showing up despite the challenges, and internalized that as strength. When Sarah was 7, she came home from school with tears streaming down her face. "What happened?" Elena asked immediately, kneeling to be at her level. "Tommy Henderson said fathers are supposed to be strong, and mine can't even walk right," Sarah hiccuped through her sobs. "He said you're broken and that's why you can't do normal things." Kyle's stomach clenched. This was the moment he'd been dreading, when Sarah would start to see him through others' eyes, when the injury would become something to be ashamed of rather than just a fact of life. He sat down carefully, bringing himself to her height. "Sarah, look at me." She turned tear-filled eyes his way. "Am I broken?" "Tommy said—" "I'm not asking what Tommy said. I'm asking what you think. Do you think I'm broken?" Sarah sniffled, thinking about it. "Your leg doesn't work right." "That's true. It doesn't. But does that make me broken?" "I don't know." "Let me tell you what I think. I think everyone has parts of themselves that don't work the way they'd like. Some people have bodies that don't cooperate. Some have minds that work differently. Some have hearts that hurt in ways you can't see. None of that makes them broken. It just makes them human." He brushed tears from her face. "My leg was damaged in the war. That's true. But I'm not broken, Sarah. I'm adapted. I've learned to do things differently because I have to, and that's made me better at solving problems and helping people in ways I never would have thought of before." "But you can't run or play like other fathers." "No, I can't. But I can teach you how to think through challenges, can show you that there's more than one way to be strong, can prove that when life knocks you down, you get back up, maybe with a cane and a limp, but you get up anyway." He pulled her close. "Tommy Henderson is alive because I used my brain and my experience to save him twice." His words come from not understanding that strength isn't just muscles and running. It's also showing up every day and doing what needs to be done, no matter how hard it is. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she said, "You're the strongest person I know." "I don't know about that." "I do. Because you don't give up. Even when things are hard or people say you can't do something, you find a way." She wrapped her arms around his neck. "I'm proud you're my father." Cale held his daughter and felt years of insecurity finally begin to settle. She saw him clearly, limitations and all, and she was proud of him anyway. Not despite what he couldn't do, but because of how he'd adapted to it. Over dinner that night, Elena told Sarah the whole story, how Kyle had been injured saving a soldier, how he'd been scared to come home because he thought being damaged made him worthless, how he'd eventually learned that his value came from who he was, not what he could physically do. "Everyone struggles with feeling like they're not enough," Elena said. "Your father struggled with it. I struggle with it sometimes, but the truth is you're always enough if you're trying your best and treating people with kindness. Everything else is just details." Sarah nodded seriously, absorbing the lesson. Then she turned to Kyle. "Did you really think Mama wouldn't want you because of your leg?" "I did. I was wrong, but yes." "That was silly. Mama loves you for your inside parts, not your leg." Out of the mouths of children came the simplest, truest wisdom. Cale glanced at Elena, who was smiling that soft smile she got when their daughter said something particularly profound. "You're right," Cale said. "It was silly. But sometimes grown-ups are silly too. We forget important things when we're scared." "I won't forget," Sarah declared. "When I grow up and something's hard, I'm going to remember that you kept trying anyway, and then I'll try too. As the years continued to pass, Kyle watched his daughter grow into a remarkable young woman who'd learned from both her parents. Elena's determination and practicality, Kyle's analytical mind and refusal to be limited by circumstances. Sarah became the kind of person who saw problems as puzzles to be solved rather than walls to stop her, who helped her neighbors without expecting recognition, who understood that strength came in many forms. The town of Red Mesa grew around them, becoming more established, more connected to the wider world. But the community bonds remained strong, built on the foundation of people who showed up for each other when things got hard. Kyle's emergency response system was adopted by 3 neighboring counties. He trained coordinators across the region, sharing knowledge he'd gained through military experience and civilian application. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself before the war. He'd thought he'd be nothing more than a hired hand, earning his keep through physical labor and moving on when the work was done. Instead, he'd built something that mattered, a marriage that had survived his worst mistakes and grown stronger for it. A daughter who knew her worth wasn't tied to perfection. A community role that used his actual strengths instead of mourning his limitations. A legacy that would outlive him. One evening, when Sarah was 15 and starting to make her own plans for the future, she asked Kyle what he'd learned from everything he'd been through. They were on the porch, always the porch, where the big conversation seemed to happen, watching the sun paint the desert in familiar colors. I learned that being broken isn't the same as being worthless, Kyle said after thinking about it. That the things we think define us often don't matter nearly as much as we believe. And that love, real love, isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about choosing someone imperfect and building something together that's stronger than either of you could create alone. Is that what you and Mama did? That's exactly what we did. I tried to protect her from my imperfections by staying away, and all it did was hurt us both. The real courage wasn't surviving the war or the injury. It was coming back here and letting her see me, really see me, damaged parts and all, and trusting that she meant it when she said she loved me anyway. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you came back, even though it took you a while. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. Elena joined them, settling into the space that had always been hers, and the 3 of them sat together as the desert swallowed the sun. It was ordinary and simple and perfect in its imperfection. A family that had been forged through trial and mistake and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. Years later, when Kyle's hair had gone fully gray and his knee required even more accommodation than before, he'd look back on his life and see the pattern clearly. Not a straight line from point to point, but a messy, complicated journey full of wrong turns and hard lessons, and moments where he'd almost given up entirely. The war had taken pieces of him he'd never get back, but it had also taught him things he couldn't have learned any other way, about resilience and adaptation, about the difference between surviving and living, about what actually mattered when everything else was stripped away. He'd come to Red Mesa broken, convinced his damage made him worthless. He'd left for war and come back even more broken, too afraid to face what he'd lost. But Elena had refused to let him hide in that brokenness. She'd demanded he show up, be honest, stop making decisions based on fear disguised as protection. And in doing that, in forcing him to be vulnerable, to accept help, to believe his value came from more than his physical capability. She'd given him something more precious than healing. She'd given him the chance to be whole in a different way, to build a life that mattered not despite his limitations but incorporating them. Their daughter would carry that forward, would teach her own children someday that strength wasn't the absence of weakness, but the courage to keep going when things were hard. That love wasn't about finding someone who completed you, but about choosing someone who challenged you to become better than you thought possible. The wooden bird Elena had carved all those years ago sat on Kyle's desk, worn smooth from decades of handling. It had traveled with him through war and recovery, through 5 years of exile and the long journey home. It had reminded him, even when he couldn't believe it, that some things were worth coming back to, some things were worth fighting for, some things, like love, like family, like the courage to be imperfect and try anyway, were worth everything. Kyle had started as a broken soldier who thought his damage made him unfit for a normal life. He'd ended up as a husband, father, and community leader who'd proven that brokenness could be transformed into strength if you were willing to do the work. The scars remained. The limp never went away. The pain was a constant companion. But those things didn't define him anymore. They were just part of his story, the difficult chapters that made the happy ending possible. And when Kyle looked at his life, at the woman who'd refused to let him give up, and the daughter who'd learned that limitations weren't the end of possibility, he understood something fundamental about the human experience. We're all damaged in some way, all carrying scars from battles we've fought, losses we've endured, mistakes we've made. The question isn't whether we're broken, it's what we choose to do with the broken pieces. Do we hide them away, convinced they make us worthless? Or do we bring them into the light, let others help us sort through them, and build something new from what remains? Kyle had chosen wrong for a long time, had let fear and shame keep him from the life he wanted. But eventually, with Elena's help and his own stubborn refusal to give up entirely, he'd chosen right. He'd chosen to show up broken and trust it would be enough. And it was. It always had been.